Hey guys, Brent Hull Build Show. 5 things, 5 lessons you need to keep in mind to build an awesome porch. Come join me today in the Build Show. Okay, so the first thing is columns, guys. Columns support the porch and make it work, but how do you get the right size column? How do you make sure you understand what's going on? A real quick rule of thumb is that for every foot of the porch height, right, is the thickness of the column at the base. So if you look at the classical system, this is an 8-foot model, right? There's an 8-foot ceiling. I did that video on how do you do moldings in an 8-foot house, right? How do you get that right? Here is the way it's laid out classically, okay? And so my column at the base, okay, is right above the, base, the moldings is, 7.5 inches. The dimension at the top, okay, is 6 3/8, okay? So the neck of the column, this is called the neck right there, in between that astragal and the capital. It's called the neck, but the column shrinks, okay? So the first thing you gotta do is you gotta get the columns right. And if you take that rule that for every foot of column, let's say we have a porch, we have a column, here's our porch, here's the steps coming down, right? We got a column over this way. And I've got what's here up in entablature, right? So let's just say that dimension from your porch floor up to your beam is 8 foot, okay? I would have an 8-inch column. 8 inches is measured at the base of this thing. It's a real simple rule. If you can get the column so that it's classically proportioned, what does that mean? You'll see columns sometimes from builder yards, from lumber yards that aren't classically correct. Meaning they don't have entasis, okay, which is that thing from growing from the base to the top. What happens, guys, is with entasis, basically the top third of the column, so basically up to here it's straight, and then from that third up to the neck, it starts shrinking down. It is 1/6 smaller at the top than it is at the base, and it starts from the third up. You'll see columns that do this, okay? And I'm exaggerating, right? They maybe that exaggeration doesn't help because it looks like a taper column. But you'll have columns that, let's just say this perfect one, okay, has this entasis, right? It's 1/3 up, and then it goes to the top where it tapers this way. You have the ones that do this, okay, where they're just kind of angled right from the bottom to the top, and then you'll have columns that are just straight tubes, okay? So it's very important, okay, very important that you get the column with entasis, okay? One of the things that's going to make your porch great is that entasis. Now why? Because if you look back, every column pre-1940, okay, has entasis. Columns after 1940 don't. So if you want that classical 1920s, turn of the century porch that looks so good, you need the column with entasis. So that's the big lesson. That's number one, get the columns right. Get the classical column. So the points are, get a classical column with entasis, E-N-T-A-S-I-S, okay? And then properly proportioned, okay? With the right heft. Now, in this scenario, if I have an 8-foot thing and I do an 8-foot at the base and it looks a little weak, okay, I can do a 10-inch, right? And all of a sudden I have a little bit of thicker column. It's a little bit stronger. Maybe it's an arts and crafts porch and you want something a little more manly in there, a little more rotund, right? Go with a 10-inch column. So you can adjust that girth, right? And so that you can get a different look, okay? But columns are that important thing. Getting that column right is huge. The second piece is this area up here called an entablature, okay? An entablature is this area here. It's made up of your architrave, your frieze, and your cornice, okay? Having that column in there, having that beam in there is very important, okay? Because a lot of times what will happen on new builds, if I did a section right here, okay, what you would have is you would have your molding on the outside of your porch. This little frieze comes down, hopefully a bed mold, okay? And then you'd have a frieze, and then you'd have your frieze, your little architrave, and then going up on the inside, you'd have that same molding, and then you'd have your porch ceiling in here, okay? And this was typically a beadboard porch ceiling. Now, what happens is that the column comes down here, right? And, you know, supports your porch. Now, over 50% of new porches have no beam in there, okay? They've taken out that entablature because you really don't need it, okay? So what the builder does is they go, look, my joist comes across here. I can put my crown right in there. I don't need that beam. You do need the beam. You do need that entablature so that your column doesn't go right to your porch ceiling, okay? This beam is what gives it that visual beauty, okay, that looks like it's supporting something. Because when you run your column right to the ceiling of your porch, you're not giving any shadow lines, you're not giving any depth, you're not communicating that it's, you know, that those tectonics, right, that make it look like it's being held up properly. So again, pre-1940 porches always have the entablature, always have emphasis, and so make sure that number 2 here is your entablature. And your entablature is basically the beam that supports the porch, the visual look that makes your porch feel right and look right. The other thing that's happened is, look, if we were measuring our porch over here and all of a sudden I say, well, it's an 8 foot tall in here, so I want an 8 foot column at the base, measured at the base as far as this height goes, right? What happens though if I don't have that entablature, right? If I just have this beam that runs up here, okay? The column that runs right to the porch ceiling, okay? Then my proportions get messed up in here. My proportions start looking funny. And a lot of houses will have little toothpick columns that go right up to the porch ceiling that don't seem to support anything. If you're playing around with these classical rules, but you're not using all the classical parts, your porches can look sickly. They can look like they're not finished. They look like there's something wrong with them. And so really, guys, we're going back to the past. We're learning from the past that the proper way to build a porch is with an entablature so that you've got this moldings, you've got these shadow lines in here, and then the column that supports that communicates that nostalgia, communicates that building heritage that is so important in order to make it look right. Number 3, okay, is the beam column connection, okay? Beam column is, I'm talking about avoiding this, okay? Because the connection there is the column running right up to the ceiling. What happens when you put that beam in there, okay, is there's a width that takes place here. What happens is when you do that column and entablature connection properly, okay, when this is properly done and this is communicating this beam that is supported by this column, okay, you're going back and introducing classical principles that have been practiced for 2,000 years, okay? And so realizing, certainly on the building side, as builders, we need to understand our past. We need to understand our trade, our profession, the ways we used to build. So getting this column connection right is a huge deal, okay? So one, you got your entablature. You have to have these parts and pieces to make it look right. But two, when you do your beam connection, okay, and this is huge, guys, is that my column capital, okay, there's my beam, there's my column, there's the neck of my column coming up, there's my astragal, there's my capital. Let's just do it that way, okay? That my beam, okay, my entablature is the same width as the neck. So this is the neck, right in there. That width, let's just say that you've got a 10-inch column. Well, let's just use this, right? Because at the neck, right, I'm 6 1/4 right there, okay? That means that this beam, right, you'll notice that the neck of this column lines up with the beam as it goes above here. That means on the inside of this thing, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, is going to be the same thing as that line going up is going to establish this molding, okay, and that beam above it, okay? So on the inside, I'll have this same molding, right? I'll have that same little step there, So I'm going to be lining it up. So there's my beam, okay, above. And notice, guys, that there is going to be this overhang, okay? And I did a video on the importance of this overhang, and people were like, well, it's going to collect water. It's going to stop it, okay? Start building it properly, like you know what the heck you're doing, and always have this overhang here, because what's happening is this is the shaft, okay, that gives visual support, okay? So it's not necessary that little molding, that little terminating molding right there, be underneath this beam and support. This can't support anything. It's this shaft, okay, that's providing the visual strength. And so I've made number 3 here, that beam column connection, because it's so important, okay? 1, your capital, okay, extends outside of the beam, okay? It's huge, okay? Get that right, guys. If you can just get that right, you'll be doing so much better work. Look at this connection here. This is the ionic order, okay? So these are from the ICAA, but notice here, same thing, my ionic capital, okay? There's the neck of the column coming up, lining up with the beam as it comes across. There's my ionic capital sticking outside of that area, okay? So the strength comes up through here, it's communicated through here, right? Remember, this column is very tall, right? So that shaft running up is going to communicate that strength. I don't need this to communicate the strength. Second, my beam on the inside is going to match this same molding, so it's going to come up, it's going to go, okay, then it's going to go up. I'm going to do it again. Right? So there's the inside of my beam. So that whole shaded area, right, is my beam on the inside, and then my bead-gored ceiling back is back here. But there is the beam lined up with the neck of the column. So I don't know how to say that any more importantly, okay, but that connection, okay, having that entablature and having that beam, okay, the capital extends outside of the beam. That's what I was talking about. And the neck of the column equals width of beam. Okay? So, to understand, right? Now you know how to build a classical porch, that if you're building this porch, okay, we've got to have our entablature coming across, and that beam on the inside, right, runs up, and that neck and that beam match. Okay, that's number 3. Okay, the first one's the column, second one's the entablature, basics, the bread and butter, the blocking and tackling of this thing, and then the third is getting that connection right. Okay, so understand? I want to stay here until you know you understand. I just can't express how important those simple blocking and tackling pieces are to getting your porch right. Number 4, okay, porch railing, okay? Just did a Wednesday video on a historic house in Austin, and basically, let's just say the ground's right here if we're going to use this same porch. If this distance, okay, is less than 2 feet, you do not need to have a railing across here, okay? So a lot of times what happens, guys, is there's this rule that you got to be at 36 or 42, and you end up creating these cages inside that block off that you can't really see in that proportion. Remember this whole system is a classical system. My porch railing's this high, okay? That's where my porch railing starts, is off the pedestal cap. So if I have an 8-foot, column there, yes, I'm going to have a little 18 2-foot railing that's going to run across here, okay? Now you might say, what is going on? Someone's going to trip over that. Fine, don't have it if you're only 18, 24 inches there. But if you want on the back side, if you've ever been in an historic porch, you know that those things are pretty low and that you're sitting down on them. They're 24 inches on 10-foot ceilings and stuff like that. So, historically, because of this classical system, the porch railings are low. So start, especially when you don't need them for code, go back to the classical system and make sure that porch railing is at the proper height. One last little trick here when I talk about these connections is that when you build the porch, okay, so let's say you're building your porch, you've done your beam, right, and you've got your column, you've got your porch floor in here. The line of that beam is not, okay, because just sometimes what happens is the guys will build the porch floor the same width of that beam above. What's wrong with that? What's going to happen? When I put my column with entasis, okay, I'm actually going to be hanging out over top of that porch floor. So this porch floor needs to extend further. You need to work out the details. But if my beam's coming down, and if I dropped a plumb line on this thing right here, you would see that, you know, my porch, look what's happening. Not only is this column gone out because it's wider, I've now got a base molding. I've got this plinth, right, coming down, okay? So up there, my beam is probably right in here, but I actually need to extend this another, 2 inches or so in order to make sure that I can catch this plinth properly, okay? Pretend my porch floor comes across here and I need to be out here. You need to add 2 to 3 inches to your thing. So just a little trick there, that when you're building your porch floor, it's going to stick out farther because you're using a classical column, because it's wider at the base than it is at the top, because of entasis. You need to build your porch floor wider, okay? Last is, and it's not really the last, but it's part of the story, it's part of what you're doing, is design. And design means that there's a bunch of traditions, okay? Remember, we've been building classically for 2,000 years, okay? That means they used this in the Renaissance, that means they used this in the early Georgian period, the Federal period, the Greek Revival period, the Victorian period, arts and crafts, right? And then period revival. So there's a number of architectural traditions that treat porches a little bit differently. If this was a Victorian porch, it would have a lot more ornamentation and detail, right? It would be expressed differently. Sometimes during the Victorian era, they turned their columns, they turned their posts, and there's a bunch of decoration and detail in here. Sometimes following the classical tradition with the Victorians is really difficult, okay? Because you're like, they've used brackets and ornamentation instead of that classical entablature. But the proportions are still there. Trust me, I've measured it out, I've looked at it. So you've got to understand your design so that you can make all these decisions properly. And you're looking at historic precedent in order to get it right. And look, guys, if you really want to understand these details properly, go find a porch you love and go measure it, okay? Measure that column and compare it to the height. Go, oh, look, they did a 1 to 10 ratio or a 1 to 8 ratio. I really like that ratio between the column width and the column's height, okay? Look at the amount of ornamentation. Look how high the porch railing is. Look how big their entablature is. Look how wide the beam is. You will learn so much if you just go to the past and look at the way we used to build, because all of these details, okay, there's a lot of, clues and hints and stuff in here, but getting those things right really does make a big difference. And it shows you how hard porches are. Porches are not easy to build. You go, I'll build a porch. Okay, the subtlety, the nuances that take place in porches is a big deal. And I haven't even talked about it, like a real high style porch, okay, with Corinthian columns. First of all, never use Corinthian columns. They're very hard to get it right, okay? So learn how to do a Doric or a Tuscan porch before you go out and practice on a Corinthian porch, okay? Or find a great Corinthian porch and study it, like you're cramming for your life there. But understanding all those classical traditions, all those details and everything else really are important. Really, there's a lot of subtleties in between styles and in between, architectural periods that if you can become an expert at, then you start to move towards being a master builder. That's when you start, leveling up and really making a big difference in the things that you build and the things that you design. Let me know what you think. A lot of things here. If you have questions, send send me an email. But when this goes on YouTube, it'll start on the Build Show, it goes on YouTube. I answer all of those questions in the commentary, YouTube/Brent Hull, where all my videos are, along with Wednesday videos. You'll see a lot of those in there. So there's a lot of stuff going on there, and this stuff, of course, we talk about it on our podcast, Passion for Craft. So a lot of ways to learn, a lot of ways to get better, help you become a master builder. I'm Brent Hull. Thanks for watching.